The man sitting at the back of the bus had no idea he was about to change a life that didn't even belong to his world, and the moment it happened, everything ordinary inside that crowded afternoon ride would quietly begin to disappear. It was just after 4 p.m. in downtown Chicago, the kind of late weekday rush where the air inside a city bus feels heavier than the traffic outside, and every seat becomes a small negotiation between exhaustion and patience. Daniel Harper stood near the middle aisle holding onto a worn strap above him, his work jacket still carrying the faint scent of delivery routes and long hours on the road, while his thoughts stayed fixed on the small voice of his daughter waiting for him at home with dinner she probably reheated herself again. He wasn't a man who asked for attention, and life had taught him that silence often cost less than explanation, but when the bus hit a small bump near the intersection of Wabash and Monroe, he noticed her. A woman seated near the front, visibly pregnant, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, her breathing measured but strained as if every stop and start of the vehicle required careful negotiation with her own body. No one else seemed to react, or maybe they did and simply chose not to act, the way people do when the world becomes too busy to notice something quiet unfolding in plain sight. Daniel didn't hesitate. He moved forward slowly, steadying himself as the bus swayed, and spoke gently so he wouldn't startle her or the people around them, offering his seat with a calm certainty that felt more like habit than heroism. For a moment, the woman looked up at him with an expression that didn't quite belong to the situation, something layered and unreadable beneath exhaustion, as if she was used to being seen but not truly recognized. Around them, a few passengers exchanged glances, subtle and sharp, the kind that measured value without saying a word, and someone muttered something under their breath about people making things complicated when they didn't need to. Daniel ignored it, focusing only on making sure she was steady as she accepted the seat, his hand briefly holding the rail above her as the bus shifted again. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, her voice soft but controlled, and Daniel gave a faint shake of his head as if the answer was too simple to explain. "It's just a seat," he replied, though something in the way he said it suggested it was never really about the seat at all. What he didn't know, what no one on that bus could have possibly known, was that the woman sitting there wasn't just another passenger caught in the city's rush-hour rhythm, and that somewhere beyond the glass windows and endless rows of traffic lights, something far larger had already begun moving in silence toward the exact place they were sitting, as if the city itself had decided this moment mattered more than anyone yet understood. The bus continued its steady crawl through the late afternoon streets, but something about the space between people inside it no longer felt ordinary, as if the simple act that had just taken place had shifted the air in ways no one could quite explain. Daniel Harper stood a few steps away from the seat he had given up, holding the overhead rail again, his eyes occasionally drifting back to make sure the woman was steady, not because he thought she needed help anymore, but because something about her presence carried a quiet weight that made it hard to look away completely. She sat upright despite her exhaustion, hands still resting over her stomach, breathing controlled but deliberate, like she was managing more than just physical discomfort. For a brief moment, her eyes lowered to the small screen of her phone, and the glow reflected across her face revealed a flicker of focus that did not belong to someone simply passing through an ordinary commute. Lines of text appeared and disappeared quickly on the screen, messages marked with short confirmations and time stamps that suggested coordination rather than conversation, and then just as quickly, she turned the screen off and returned to stillness, as if nothing had happened at all. Daniel noticed, but he did not stare, only filed it away in the quiet part of his mind where small things sometimes gathered without meaning until later. Around them, the bus remained indifferent, filled with the familiar rhythm of city life, the faint hum of conversations, the sound of a phone notification chiming somewhere in the back, and the occasional shifting of passengers preparing for their stop. The woman finally spoke again. Without looking up, her voice calm but softer than before, asking him why he had helped her when no one else had moved. Daniel paused for a moment, not because he needed to think of something clever, but because the answer was not something he usually said out loud. He simply replied that sometimes people just need help standing for a while, and if you are already there, it does not cost anything to offer it. She nodded slowly, as if weighing his words against something heavier in her own thoughts, then looked out the window where the skyline of downtown Chicago blurred into reflections of glass and steel. Her name, when it came later from a faint announcement she made while adjusting her bag, was Emily Carter, though the way she said it suggested it was not the name she used often in moments like this. Daniel did not react beyond a simple acknowledgement, but inside, something about the way she carried that name felt different, as if it belonged to two lives at once, one visible and one carefully hidden. A few minutes later, her phone lit up again, this time with a single message that made her expression tighten just slightly before smoothing back into calm control, and Daniel, standing only a few feet away, noticed the change even if he could not understand its cause. Outside the bus, traffic lights cycled through their endless rhythm, and somewhere far beyond the streets they were traveling through, arrangements were already being made in silence, unseen and precise, as if the world had begun preparing for something that had not yet fully revealed itself. The bus moved through downtown Chicago with a steady rhythm, yet inside it the atmosphere had begun to feel subtly different, as if the ordinary flow of commuters had been folded into something quieter and more deliberate. Daniel Harper remained standing near the center rail, his posture unchanged, but his attention had slowly narrowed to the woman seated a few feet away, not out of suspicion, but out of a growing awareness that her stillness was not the same kind of stillness he was used to seeing in tired passengers. Emily Carter kept her gaze lowered for most of the ride, one hand resting protectively over her stomach while the other occasionally adjusted the strap of a simple leather bag placed beside her feet, a bag that looked unremarkable at first glance but seemed to carry a weight of importance that matched her careful movements. Every few minutes, her phone would vibrate softly, and each time she would glance at it with a controlled expression that revealed nothing outwardly, though the subtle tightening of her fingers suggested that whatever she was reading carried significance far beyond casual messages. Daniel noticed these details the way a man notices weather before a storm, not because he expected anything to happen, but because life had taught him that small patterns often mattered more than loud moments. The bus slowed at a stop near a wide intersection, and sunlight briefly poured through the windows, illuminating dust in the air and reflecting off the metal rails in soft flashes that made everything feel suspended in time. Emily shifted slightly in her seat and exhaled slowly, as if centering herself, then looked up for the first time in several minutes directly toward Daniel. There was no urgency in her expression, only a calm recognition, as if she had been observing him just as carefully as he had been observing her. She asked him quietly if he always helped strangers, and Daniel responded after a brief pause that it was not something he planned, only something that made sense when the moment called for it. Her expression softened slightly at that answer, and for a brief instant, the distance between them felt less defined, as if the bus itself had become smaller. Then her phone lit up again, brighter this time, and the notification was accompanied by a soft tone that carried a different weight than before, one that made her glance toward the front of the bus rather than down. Outside, the cityscape began to shift from dense buildings to wider open stretches, and Daniel noticed a subtle change in how Emily positioned herself, as if preparing for something that had not yet arrived but was already in motion. She checked the time on her phone, then typed a single short message with deliberate precision before turning the screen off completely and placing it face down in her lap. The silence that followed was not empty but structured, like the pause between decisions that had already been made elsewhere. Daniel looked out the window briefly and saw a stretch of open sky between buildings where a faint distant sound, almost imperceptible, seemed to blend with the city noise, though he could not identify its source. Emily followed his gaze upward for a moment, then returned her attention forward, her expression steady and composed, yet carrying an unmistakable sense that something was approaching from beyond the ordinary flow of the day. The bus continued forward, unaware of any meaning being attached to its path, while inside it two strangers remained connected by a quiet act that neither of them yet understood fully, and somewhere beyond the visible horizon of the city, arrangements continued to align with silent precision, closing distance toward a moment that was steadily becoming unavoidable. The bus had now left the dense core of downtown Chicago behind, moving along a wider stretch of road where the buildings became lower and the sky opened up in slow, pale gradients of afternoon light, and yet inside the vehicle the sense of stillness had deepened rather than faded. Daniel Harper remained standing in the same place, one hand steady on the overhead rail, his body moving gently with the motion of the bus, while his attention continued to return to the woman seated near the front as if drawn by something he could not logically explain. Emily Carter sat with her posture unchanged, composed and quiet, but there was now a noticeable difference in the way she observed her surroundings, not with distraction or fatigue, but with a calm awareness that suggested she was measuring time rather than passing through it. Her phone rested face down in her lap, no longer lighting up, yet that silence seemed intentional, as if whatever messages had come earlier were part of a process now completed rather than ongoing. Daniel noticed the change but said nothing, his life having taught him that questions were not always welcome in moments where people were preparing inwardly for something unspoken. A few seats away, other passengers continued their routines, some looking out the window, others scrolling through their devices, unaware of the subtle shift that seemed to separate the space around Emily from the rest of the bus. As the vehicle approached a long stretch of highway bordered by open lots and distant industrial buildings, a faint vibration passed through the cabin, different from the usual engine rhythm, causing a few heads to briefly lift in curiosity before settling again. Daniel felt it too, not as something alarming, but as a change in the environment, like pressure shifting before weather. Emily, however, reacted differently, her eyes lifting toward the front windshield with quiet precision, as if confirming something she had already expected rather than discovering it in real time. For a brief moment, she adjusted the strap of her bag again, then placed both hands calmly over her stomach, grounding herself in a way that felt practiced and intentional. Daniel followed her gaze through the front glass, scanning the sky and the road ahead, and that was when he noticed what others had not yet fully registered, a faint distant shape moving against the horizon line, too small at first to identify clearly but growing steadily with purpose. The bus driver slowed slightly at the next traffic light, and in that pause of motion, the sound outside the vehicle seemed to shift again, a low and distant presence that did not belong to the usual rhythm of city transportation. Inside the bus, a few passengers finally began to notice something unusual and leaned forward to see better, their curiosity slowly replacing their indifference. Emily remained completely still, her expression unchanged, but her focus was now fully directed forward, no longer divided by anything else. Daniel turned his head slightly toward her, as if silently asking without words what was happening, but she did not answer, only exhaled once in a controlled, steady breath that suggested confirmation rather than surprise. The bus continued forward, approaching the edge of a wide open area where the road curved gently, and the distant shape in the sky became more defined, revealing movement that did not belong to ordinary traffic or routine travel. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere that had once been casual and indifferent now carried a quiet tension, not of fear, but of recognition that something significant was approaching a point of arrival, and Daniel Harper, still unaware of its meaning, remained standing exactly where he was, beside a moment that was seconds away from becoming irreversible. The bus had entered a quieter stretch of roadway now, where the city's density gave way to open lanes, scattered commercial buildings, and wide gaps of sky that made everything feel more exposed, and inside that expanding space of visibility, every small change felt amplified as if the world itself had lowered its voice to listen. Daniel Harper stood in the same position, but his attention had fully sharpened, no longer drifting between thoughts of home and routine, because what he now saw through the front windshield could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or distance. The shape in the sky had grown clearer, resolving into a controlled and deliberate movement that did not match any aircraft pattern he was familiar with in everyday city life, and the faint sound that accompanied it had begun to cut through the bus engine in a way that made several passengers finally lift their heads in awareness. Emily Carter remained seated, perfectly still, her posture composed with a level of control that suggested she was not reacting to what was coming, but instead acknowledging its arrival, as though the timing had already been determined long before this moment. Daniel glanced toward her again, and this time he noticed something different in her expression, not surprise, not concern, but a calm certainty that made the situation feel less like discovery and more like confirmation. The bus driver slowed further as traffic began to thin, and the vehicle approached a long open corridor of road where visibility extended far ahead in both directions, leaving no distraction from the sky above. At that exact moment, the distant shape shifted position, descending slightly with a smooth and controlled motion that immediately separated it from everything else in the air, and the sound deepened into something structured and unmistakably intentional. Inside the bus, the first passenger spoke quietly, pointing toward the front, and within seconds others followed, their attention pulled fully away from their phones and conversations as the realization spread that something unusual was unfolding just beyond the windshield. Daniel stepped slightly forward in the aisle to see more clearly, his hand still gripping the overhead rail, his expression focused but calm, as if trying to understand what kind of situation would require this level of presence in the sky above a public roadway. Emily finally turned her head slightly toward him, not to explain, but to acknowledge that he was now seeing what she had already known would appear, and in that brief exchange of glances, there was a silent understanding forming between them that neither had words for yet. The bus came to a gradual stop at a light near a wide-open intersection bordered by empty lots and low industrial structures, and the moment the vehicle halted, the sound outside became clearer, revealing itself as the unmistakable approach of a coordinated aerial arrival rather than random movement. Several passengers stood halfway from their seats, uncertain whether to remain seated or move closer to the windows, while the driver leaned forward in his seat, trying to identify the source of the disturbance in the sky. Daniel's focus remained fixed on the approaching presence, which now filled a significant portion of the horizon, its motion steady and deliberate, as if guided directly toward a precise destination rather than simply passing overhead. Emily adjusted her posture once more, placing her feet firmly on the floor, and for the first time since the journey began, she looked fully prepared to stand. The bus interior had shifted completely from ordinary commuter silence to collective stillness, where even breathing seemed measured, and every eye was directed toward the same point above the road. Daniel remained beside her seat, not yet understanding the meaning behind what he was witnessing, but fully aware that the moment had crossed a threshold from the familiar into something far more significant, as the approaching presence in the sky aligned itself directly over their position, reducing the distance between the ordinary world and whatever was about to arrive next. The moment stretched inside the bus like a held breath that no one dared to release, as every passenger remained frozen in their seats or half standing in the aisle, all eyes locked through the front windshield where the sky had become the center of every possible explanation and none of them felt sufficient. Daniel Harper stood closest to the front half of the bus interior now, his body angled slightly toward the glass as he tried to maintain a clear line of sight, while still staying near Emily Carter, who had finally shifted from stillness into a controlled readiness that felt deliberate rather than reactive. The aerial presence above had now fully entered the visible field, descending with a smooth precision that made it clear this was not random movement but a coordinated approach toward a specific point on the ground, and the subtle vibration in the air had grown into a steady auditory presence that filled the silence inside the bus without requiring volume. Outside, the intersection remained paused under a red light, vehicles waiting in all directions unaware that the rhythm of normal traffic had been quietly suspended by something far above them. Emily stood slowly from her seat, her movement calm and unhurried, as if she had already accounted for every second leading to this moment long before the bus had arrived here, and Daniel instinctively stepped slightly aside to give her space while still remaining close enough to observe what was unfolding. For a brief second, their eyes met again, and this time there was no uncertainty between them, only the quiet recognition that whatever was arriving was connected directly to her presence. The sound from above shifted again, lowering in pitch and becoming more structured, and several passengers inside the bus pressed closer to the windows, trying to understand what they were witnessing, while others remained completely still, unable to reconcile the scene with anything they had experienced in their daily routines. Emily reached for her bag and adjusted the strap across her shoulder, then placed one hand briefly over her stomach, not in hesitation but in steady composure, as though grounding herself for an expected transition. Daniel noticed the precision in her movements, the absence of panic, and the way she seemed to align herself with the timing of what was descending above rather than resisting it. Outside, the aerial presence now dominated the sky above the intersection, its position stabilized directly over the road ahead, casting a faint shifting shadow across the vehicles waiting at the light, and in that shared stillness, even the smallest sounds inside the bus felt amplified. A few passengers whispered questions, but no one had answers, and the uncertainty only deepened the sense that they were witnessing something carefully planned rather than accidental. Emily took a slow step toward the front of the bus, then paused, her gaze fixed upward through the glass, and Daniel followed her movement instinctively, still not understanding the full meaning but sensing that the moment had reached its final threshold. The bus driver remained motionless at his seat, hands resting near the controls, watching the sky through the windshield as if waiting for instruction from a world that no longer operated on normal signals. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm and steady, not loud enough to command attention but clear enough for Daniel to hear beside her, and she said only that it was time, without adding explanation or urgency. At that exact moment, the aerial presence above aligned perfectly with the open space. Ahead of the intersection, holding position with a stability that suggested completion rather than arrival, and the entire scene below seemed to pause in response. Daniel stood still, absorbing the impossibility of the moment, while Emily prepared to move forward, and the bus, still stopped at the light, became the quiet center of a situation that had expanded far beyond anything its passengers had expected when they boarded earlier that afternoon. The bus remained completely still at the intersection, held in place by the red light that no one seemed to care about anymore, because every eye inside the vehicle was now focused on what was happening above the road rather than anything happening at ground level. Daniel Harper stood close to the front, his hand still gripping the overhead rail, his entire attention locked between the windshield and the woman beside him, as if he was caught in the narrow space between understanding and disbelief. Emily Carter had not moved since she spoke the words that signaled it was time, and now she stepped forward with calm precision, her presence shifting from passenger to something closer to a central point of focus, though she still carried herself with quiet restraint rather than display. Outside, the aerial presence had stabilized directly above the intersection, holding position in a controlled hover that made the surrounding environment feel almost secondary, as if everything below had been arranged for this single alignment. The sound that accompanied it was no longer distant, but present enough to define the atmosphere through the glass, a steady and structured tone that replaced all background noise for those paying attention. Inside the bus, several passengers pressed closer to the windows, their earlier confusion replaced with silent anticipation, while others remained frozen in their seats, unable to decide whether what they were witnessing required explanation or acceptance. Daniel shifted slightly to maintain his view of Emily, noticing that her breathing remained steady and measured, her focus directed entirely forward, not upward, as if the arrival above was already part of a conclusion she had reached long before this moment. A subtle change occurred outside as the aerial presence adjusted its position by a few feet, aligning more precisely with the open space just beyond the intersection, and that adjustment triggered a quiet ripple of realization among those watching. Emily took another step forward toward the front doors of the bus, and this time the movement carried finality rather than hesitation, as if she had reached the point where remaining still was no longer necessary. Daniel instinctively followed her movement, not to stop her but to stay close enough to understand what would happen next, though understanding still felt just out of reach. The bus driver remained seated, hands near the controls, watching through the windshield with the expression of someone witnessing a situation that exceeded ordinary protocol, his hesitation reflecting the same uncertainty shared by everyone inside the vehicle. Emily placed one hand lightly on the vertical pole near the door, steadying herself as the bus remained stationary, and looked forward through the glass, her gaze fixed on a point that matched the center of the aerial presence above. Daniel noticed that her composure had not changed since the beginning of this unfolding event, only become more defined, as if each passing second had been confirming something already known rather than revealing something new. The passengers behind them fell into deeper silence, the kind that forms when observation replaces conversation entirely, and even the smallest movements become noticeable. Outside, the aerial presence maintained its position with unwavering stability, and for a brief moment, the entire intersection below felt suspended, as if time itself had adjusted to accommodate what was happening overhead. Emily finally turned her head slightly toward Daniel, offering him a brief look that carried no urgency, only acknowledgement, and in that glance there was a quiet recognition that their paths had intersected within something far larger than either of them had anticipated when the day began. Then she faced forward again, preparing to step into whatever came next. As the bus doors remained closed, the intersection remained frozen, and the world outside held its breath in perfect, silent alignment with the moment that had fully arrived. The intersection remained frozen in a state that no one inside the bus could have recognized as normal traffic behavior anymore, as if the entire city grid around them had quietly agreed to pause at the same instant, leaving only the sky above active and intentional. Daniel Harper stood at the front section of the bus, his body still angled toward the glass, his attention locked on Emily Carter, who now stood directly beside the door with a calmness that no longer felt like observation but like preparation. Outside, the aerial presence maintained its exact position above the open stretch of road, its alignment so precise that even the shifting light of the afternoon seemed to frame it, and the surrounding air carried a steady vibration that replaced the usual sounds of engines and distant horns. Inside the bus, silence had fully taken over, not the comfortable silence of waiting, but the kind that forms when everyone realizes they are witnessing a moment they cannot influence. Emily placed her hand lightly against the door release bar, not pushing it yet, but holding it as if confirming timing rather than initiating movement, and Daniel noticed that her breathing remained even, her expression unchanged, focused entirely forward. The bus driver remained seated, eyes fixed through the windshield, his posture rigid with uncertainty, as though awaiting instructions that would not come from any familiar system. Then, without warning, the aerial presence above shifted slightly, not in distance but in orientation, aligning itself with the exact forward line of the bus, and that subtle adjustment triggered a visible reaction among the passengers as more heads turned toward the front in silent anticipation. Daniel felt the change in the atmosphere before he understood it, a sense that something had reached its final point of convergence, where waiting and arrival became the same thing. Emily finally pressed the door release, and the soft mechanical sound of unlocking filled the interior of the bus, instantly magnified by the silence around it. The front doors began to open slowly, revealing the intersection outside, where the air felt different, clearer, and charged with a stillness that extended beyond normal perception. As the doors widened, the aerial presence above descended just enough to become fully defined against the sky, its motion controlled and deliberate, positioning itself directly over the open space ahead of the bus rather than above any building or traffic lane. A faint pressure in the air moved through the interior of the bus, causing a few passengers to instinctively grip their seats or railings, not out of fear but out of the natural human response to something immense and unfamiliar. Daniel remained beside Emily, watching as she stepped forward onto the first step of the bus exit, her movement slow and measured, not rushed, not hesitant, but exact in timing as if she had synchronized herself with what was unfolding above. For a brief moment, she paused on the threshold, looking straight ahead rather than upward, and Daniel saw that whatever connection existed between her and the aerial presence was not based on reaction but on alignment. The world outside seemed to narrow into a single corridor of focus, where the intersection, the bus, and the sky above were no longer separate elements but parts of one coordinated moment. Emily then stepped fully into the open air, and as she did, the aerial presence above stabilized into complete stillness, holding its position as if acknowledging her arrival below. Daniel followed one step behind, remaining just inside the doorway, his eyes moving between her and the sky, still unable to assign meaning but fully aware that what he was witnessing was not random or accidental. The passengers inside the bus remained completely silent, watching through the widening doorway as the distance between ground and sky seemed to collapse into a single point of recognition, and Emily stood calmly in the center of it all, as if the world had been waiting for her to take that exact step before anything else could continue. The moment held in a suspended quiet that felt almost unreal, as if the entire intersection had been lifted out of the normal flow of time and placed inside a space where everything was waiting for permission to continue. Daniel Harper stood just inside the open bus doorway, one hand still touching the metal frame, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding only a few feet ahead, where Emily Carter stood calmly in the center of the open road with the sky positioned directly above her like it had been arranged with intention rather than chance. The aerial presence that had drawn everyone's attention earlier remained perfectly stable, its position now fully aligned with the ground below, creating a vertical connection that made the space between earth and sky feel unusually narrow. Around them, the bus remained completely still, passengers frozen in a shared silence that no one attempted to break, their attention locked on the woman who had stepped out without hesitation and the impossible coordination happening above her. Emily did not look around at the crowd or the bus behind her, her focus remaining forward, steady and composed, as if she was not entering a new situation but completing one that had already been set in motion long before this moment. Daniel followed a half step behind her onto the pavement, staying close enough to remain present but far enough to understand that what was unfolding did not belong to ordinary explanation. The air itself felt different outside the bus, clearer and more open, carrying a faint pressure that seemed to come from above rather than around them, and even the distant sounds of traffic had faded into near irrelevance. Then, without any sudden movement, the aerial presence began its final descent, not rushing, not abrupt, but controlled with absolute precision, aligning itself with the open space just beyond the intersection where no cars or pedestrians were moving. A subtle shift passed through the environment as if the entire area had been designated for arrival, and at that exact moment, Emily finally turned her head slightly toward Daniel, offering him a calm expression that carried neither surprise nor fear, only acknowledgement that this was the point she had been moving toward. Daniel searched her face for answers but found only certainty, and before he could speak, a second layer of movement appeared above, revealing that the aerial presence was not alone but part of a coordinated arrival sequence that had been hidden from view until now. The shape above resolved into a structured form, and the unmistakable outline of a private aircraft became visible as it descended into position with remarkable control, its movement so smooth that it felt less like arrival and more like confirmation of readiness. The bus passengers behind them reacted in silence rather than noise, their disbelief expressed through stillness, as they watched what could no longer be mistaken for coincidence or misunderstanding. Emily took one final step forward onto the pavement, fully clear of the bus now, and as she did, the aircraft above settled into its final position, hovering momentarily before stabilizing as if completing a precise instruction. A soft change in sound followed, not loud but deeply noticeable, signaling completion rather than approach, and in that instant, the entire space felt transformed into something final and defined. Daniel stood beside her now, fully outside the bus, his perspective split between the woman he had helped without question and the impossible scale of what had just arrived in response to that simple act. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm and steady, carrying a tone that suggested closure rather than explanation, and she said only that everything was in place now. Above them, the private aircraft remained steady and fully present, its arrival complete, while below, the city intersection stayed frozen in collective silence, as if the world itself was waiting for the next truth to be revealed in the space between an ordinary man and the extraordinary consequence of a single act of kindness.